One star was forced to buy her own baby from an orphanage. Another staged a scene to escape the shame. And one famous mother was made to institutionalize her child because she didn't match the studio's sepia image. When pregnancy threatened their careers, these desperate stars didn't just hide their babies. They were forced by studios to make the ultimate sacrifice, and the truth about what happened to these children has been buried for decades. The Golden Girl, who wasn't allowed to be a mother. The most tragic example of this brutal system began with the girl who was arguably the most valuable asset in the history of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Judy Garland was not merely an actress. She was a billion-dollar industry wrapped in the gingham dress of a child. In 1941, at the tender age of 19, Garland married musician David Rose against the wishes of the studio. MGM, run by the formidable Louis B. Mayer, viewed Garland as a perpetual child, a profitable innocent whose image could not be tarnished by the realities of womanhood. When Garland discovered she was pregnant shortly after the wedding, the machinery of the studio system roared to life with terrifying speed. Mayer and his executives did not see a young woman starting a family. They saw a catastrophic loss of revenue. They saw a threat to the release schedule of Babes on Broadway, a film that was projected to bring in millions. To them, Garland's body did not belong to her. It belonged to the shareholders. The studio called a meeting, not with a doctor for prenatal care, but with their publicity department and Garland's own mother, Ethel Gum, who was notoriously aligned with the studio's interests over her daughter's well-being. They informed Garland that the American public would never accept their beloved Dorothy as a teenage mother. The decision was made for her, stripping her of agency over her own body. She was sent to a discreet medical facility, her absence explained away as exhaustion, a euphemism that would become a haunting refrain in Hollywood. The details of that day remained etched in Garland's memory: the cold sterility of the room, the hushed voices of the doctors paid by MGM, and the crushing sense of isolation. She was back on the soundstage within days, forced to sing and dance with a smile plastered on her face while her body was still healing from the trauma. It reinforced a cruel lesson. Her feelings, her body, and her future children were secondary to the studio's quarterly earnings. Garland was already being fed a cocktail of amphetamines and barbiturates to manage her weight and sleep schedule, substances that further destabilized her emotional state during this crisis. The studio's control was total. They monitored her menstrual cycles, her caloric intake, and her romantic entanglements with the precision of a laboratory experiment. This first pregnancy was a turning point. It was the moment Garland realized she was trapped in a gilded cage where her natural human functions were treated as contract violations. The psychological fracture caused by this event arguably set the stage for her later struggles. She had been taught that her maternal instincts were liabilities. She began to view her own body as the enemy, a vessel that betrayed her by getting pregnant and then betrayed her again by being empty. She described feeling a phantom limb sensation in her soul, a persistent ache for the part of herself that had been surgically removed to satisfy a contract. Garland later wept as she recounted the experience, describing how her own mother and the studio she trusted conspired to terminate the life within her. This trauma was not a singular event, but the beginning of a lifetime of psychological torture. The young woman who sang of rainbows and happy endings was forced to endure a reality devoid of both, realizing that to the studio, she was nothing more than property to be managed, even if it meant destroying her own flesh and blood. The sin of a saint. While Garland was forced to end her pregnancy, another queen of the screen devised a deception so elaborate it defied belief. Loretta Young was the epitome of Catholic virtue and elegance, a star whose moral standing was central to her box office appeal. However, in 1935, while filming The Call of the Wild, she began an affair with her co-star, Clark Gable. The result was a pregnancy that, if revealed, would have ended both their careers instantly. Gable was married, and Young was the symbol of purity. Unlike Garland, Young refused to end the pregnancy, driven by her devout faith. Instead, she orchestrated a cover-up that played out like a suspense thriller. With the help of her mother, Young disappeared from the public eye, claiming she was suffering from a mysterious illness that required a long convalescence in Europe. In reality, she went into hiding in a small cottage in Venice, California, far from the prying eyes of gossip columnists. She spent months in seclusion, terrified that a single slip-up or a curious neighbor would expose the scandal of the decade. The isolation was maddening for a woman used used to the adoration of millions, but the fear of social destruction was a powerful motivator. She reportedly spent her days reading scripts and knitting, while her press agents worked overtime planting stories about her recovery from a severe case of the flu or exhaustion abroad. When the baby girl was born, Young did something extraordinary. She placed her own daughter in an orphanage. This was not abandonment, but a strategic move in a long game. Months later, Young announced she was looking to adopt a child. She even hired an interior decorator to design a nursery, publicly playing the role of the eager adoptive mother. She went to the very orphanage where she had hidden her baby and adopted her biological daughter, naming her Judy Lewis. It was the acting performance of her life, executed not for an Oscar, but for survival. She invited magazines like Photoplay into her home to photograph the new family, smiling radiantly while maintaining the fiction that she had saved a poor orphan from a difficult life. The psychological strain of looking at her own child and calling her adopted must have been immense. She had to maintain this emotional distance in public, correcting anyone who noted the resemblance, living in constant fear that the child herself would put the pieces together. Young lived with the terrifying knowledge that one disgruntled nurse or one slip of the tongue could bring her entire world crashing down. She created a web of lies so dense that she eventually became trapped in it herself, unable to offer her daughter the full, truthful love she deserved. For decades, Young raised Judy as her adopted child, denying the girl the truth of her lineage even when Judy remarked on her own ears, which stuck out famously like Clark Gable's. Young would often have Judy wear bonnets or have her ears surgically pinned back to hide the telltale genetic evidence. It was a lie maintained to the grave, a secret that preserved a career but fractured the bond between mother and daughter, proving that in the golden age, the price of stardom was often the denial of one's own reality. Frank Sinatra and the impossible choice. The pressure to choose between career and family wasn't just coming from the men in suits behind mahogany desks. It had infected the stars' own minds, turning them into their own jailers. Ava Gardner, the woman Frank Sinatra called the love of his life, was the ultimate femme fatale, earthy, sensual, and untamable. Yet, beneath her confident exterior lay a woman terrified of the instability of her own life. When she became pregnant by Sinatra in the early 1950s, their marriage was a volatile mix of passion and jealousy, fueled by alcohol and violent arguments. Gardner, who had signed a strict morality clause with MGM, knew that a baby would not only breach her contract, but would be born into a war zone. She looked at her own childhood, marked by poverty and struggle in the rural South, and looked at the chaos of her life with Sinatra, the smashed hotel rooms, the late-night fights, the unrelenting paparazzi, and convinced herself she was doing the noble thing. She feared repeating the cycle of instability she had grown up with. Furthermore, MGM's morality clauses were draconian. A pregnancy out of wedlock, or even a pregnancy that interfered with a shooting schedule, could result in immediate suspension without pay. Gardner was the breadwinner for many of her family members back home. She could not afford to be cut off from the studio payroll. The financial weight of her entire extended family rested on her shoulders, making her feel that she had no choice but to prioritize the paycheck over the pregnancy. In her later memoirs, Gardner wrote with heartbreaking candor about the decision she made. She confessed that she felt she could not provide the stability a child needed. She flew to London to terminate the pregnancy, a journey she would make twice during her marriage to Sinatra. The flights across the Atlantic were lonely and filled with dread, a stark contrast to the glamorous jet-set lifestyle the magazines claimed she lived. She arranged everything with the utmost secrecy, using aliases and paying in cash to ensure no paper trail could lead back to the tabloids. Sinatra was reportedly devastated by the decisions, but Gardner stood firm, believing that bringing a child into their toxic dynamic would be an act of cruelty. She famously said that they could barely take care of themselves, let alone a baby. This pragmatism masked a deep well of sorrow. She wasn't just protecting her career, she was protecting a child from a broken home, sacrificing her own desire for motherhood in the process. Unlike the coerced procedures of other stars, Gardner framed this as a mercy to the unborn, yet the guilt haunted her. She famously stated that the penalty for her lifestyle was that she prevented the births of her children. It was a stark admission of the incompatibility between the life of a Hollywood goddess and the role of a mother. The studio breathed a sigh of relief, keeping their symbol of desire unencumbered, while Gardner carried the silent weight of what might have been her glamorous image, hiding a profound and private mourning. Howard Strickling's grim task. As the 1950s progressed, the methods of concealing these indiscretions became institutionalized, and no one was more efficient at this grim work than Howard Strickling, the publicity chief at MGM. When Lana Turner, the sweater girl who had captivated America, found herself pregnant and unmarried, she did not have to panic. She simply had to call Strickling. Turner was one of the most bankable stars in the world, and MGM protected its investments with military precision. Strickling had a network of doctors and private hospitals on the payroll, ready to perform illegal procedures under the guise of emergency surgeries. The orchestration was chilling in its efficiency. While Turner lay in a recovery room, physically battered and emotionally numb, Strickling was in the lobby distributing press releases. He was a master of spinning narratives, turning a potential scandal into a sympathy-gathering event for the star. When Turner underwent one of these procedures, the press was fed a story about a sudden attack of appendicitis or an ovarian cyst. The studio went so far as to have Turner recover in a hospital bed surrounded by flowers, inviting reporters to photograph the recovering star, effectively gaslighting the public. She would smile for the flashbulbs, her face perfectly made up by studio artists, acting the part of the brave patient recovering from routine surgery. The flowers that filled the room were often sent by the very executives who had ordered the procedure, a grotesque display of corporate faux care. Turner endured this physical trauma multiple times to maintain her status as a glamour icon. Each time, she risked infection, scarring, and permanent infertility. But the fear of losing her contract was greater than the fear of the knife. She was living proof that the studio system viewed women as interchangeable parts in a machine, valuable only as long as they remained perfect. The emotional dissociation required to survive this was immense. She had to detach from her own body to survive the industry's demands, viewing her reproductive health as just another contractual obligation to be negotiated. She learned to separate the Lana Turner on the screen from the woman in the hospital bed, creating a split in her psyche that allowed her to keep working despite the trauma. The toll on her body was immense, but the toll on her soul was incalculable. She was a woman whose reproductive system was essentially managed by a corporation. The studio's fixers ensured that the problem disappeared, allowing the fantasy of Lana Turner to remain pristine for the adoring audiences, who never guessed that the woman smiling from the hospital bed was recovering not from an illness, but from the loss of a child she was forbidden to keep. These stories are not just gossip, they are the erased history of women who suffered in silence. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard finally, help us keep their legacy alive by subscribing to our channel and hitting the bell icon so you never miss a story. The Blonde Bombshell's Silent Grief. While Lana Turner survived the studio's brutal interventions, the woman who created the blonde bombshell archetype was not so lucky. The precedent was set in blood during the dangerous days of the 1930s by the original platinum blonde, Jean Harlow. Harlow was a comedic genius with a tragic vulnerability, thrust into stardom while still practically a child. Her marriage to Paul Byrne ended in his shocking self-destruction, leaving her a widow at 21. When she became involved with William Powell and faced an unplanned pregnancy, the stakes were life and death, not just for her career, but literally for her. In the 1930s, the medical procedures used to end a pregnancy were perilous, often performed in unsanitary conditions, even for the wealthy. There were no high-end private clinics for this. Even the stars had to rely on back-alley practitioners or doctors operating in the shadows, risking infection and hemorrhage. Harlow was forced into a procedure to save her reputation, a decision that many biographers believe contributed to her overall poor health. Her mother, Mama Jean, who controlled every aspect of Harlow's life, was reportedly instrumental in pushing for the procedure to keep the money train rolling. Mama Jean was known to be overbearing, treating Jean more like a meal ticket than a daughter, and she knew that an illegitimate child would derail the gravy train. The chemicals and lack of antibiotics during that era meant that every time a star laid down on that table, she was risking her life. Harlow had suffered from scarlet fever as a child, leaving her kidneys vulnerable. The physical stress of the surgery, combined with the emotional stress of hiding it, weakened her immune system at a critical moment. When she fell ill on the set of Saratoga, doctors initially misdiagnosed her, but the underlying damage had already been done. Her body, weakened by the studio's demands and the secret surgeries, simply gave out. The tragedy was that she was surrounded by people who loved the star but failed to protect the woman. The studio was so desperate to finish the film that they propped her up for scenes even when she was visibly gray and trembling. Harlow's kidneys, already weak from a childhood childhood illness, were further stressed by the trauma. When she passed away at the age of 26 from uremic poisoning, whispers in Hollywood suggested that the damage done to her body during these secret procedures played a role in her inability to fight off the final illness. She was a victim of a system that demanded perfection on screen while treating the physical vessels of that perfection with reckless disregard, buying what she couldn't have. While some stars were forced to operating tables, Joan Crawford found herself entangled in a criminal underworld that the FBI would later investigate. It wasn't just about biology, it was about a black market transaction. Joan Crawford, a woman of immense ambition and discipline, faced a heartbreaking reality. She could not carry a pregnancy to term, rumored to be the result of earlier procedures she had undergone as a young dancer trying to break into the business. Desperate to fulfill the role of mother that fit her carefully crafted public persona, Crawford turned to the black market. She became involved with the Tennessee Children's Home Society, run by the now infamous Georgia Tann. Tann was a baby broker who kidnapped children from poor families and sold them to the wealthy. She operated with impunity, falsifying birth certificates and erasing the biological histories of the infants she sold. She preyed on young, unwed mothers in maternity wards, tricking them into signing away their rights while they were still groggy from medication. Crawford, likely unaware of the full extent of the criminal origins but certainly aware she was bypassing standard legal channels, used Tann's services to obtain her children, including her eldest, Christina. The tragedy here was multi-layered. Crawford's intense desire for a family was genuine, yet the method of building it was tainted by the corruption of the era. Crawford treated motherhood with the same rigorous perfectionism she applied to her acting. She wanted the perfect family to display in fan magazines, and Tann provided the perfect blonde-haired, blue-eyed children to match that vision. The adoption process was shockingly fast for a woman of Crawford's status, bypassing the years of waiting that normal families endured. She could essentially order a child and have one delivered, a privilege that underscored her power but also the transactional nature of her family life. The children were sometimes even returned or exchanged if they didn't fit the mold, though Crawford kept hers, molding them instead with strict discipline. She dressed them to match her, trained them to curry favor with the press, and erased any trace of their previous identities. She bought her family in the same way she bought her costumes with the best money could buy, bypassing the legal red tape that would have scrutinized a single, divorced actress. The children, stripped of their true histories and heritage, became props in Crawford's domestic publicity photos, a poignant reminder that in Hollywood, even the purest desires could be twisted by the power of money and image. The love that cost a life. Perhaps no story illustrates the devastating emotional cost of these choices better than that of Patricia Neal and Gary Cooper. In 1949, Neal, a young and fiercely talented actress, fell deeply in love with Cooper, the married icon of American masculinity. Their affair was passionate and consuming. When Neal became pregnant, she was overjoyed, believing that Cooper would leave his wife and start a new life with her. But Cooper was trapped by his image and his formidable wife, Rocky, who threatened to destroy his career if the scandal broke. Cooper, torn and guilt-ridden, delivered the crushing news to Neal. She could not have the baby. The logistics of the termination were handled not like a medical necessity, but like a covert operation. Cooper contacted a doctor in Los Angeles, who operated outside the law. Neal later described the experience as the saddest thing of my life. She sat in the car with Cooper afterward, parked on a side street in the growing dark of the evening, both of them weeping, knowing that they had sacrificed a piece of their humanity for the sake of public opinion. The silence in that car was heavier than any scream. They were two of the most famous people in the world, yet in that moment, they were utterly powerless, hiding in the shadows like fugitives. The trauma of that day haunted Neal for the rest of her life. She felt she had betrayed her own instincts and her own future for a man who, in the end, could not protect her. The psychological scars manifested physically and mentally for years. She felt a deep sense of spiritual violation, one that no amount of applause could silence. It wasn't just a medical procedure. It was a severance of the future she had imagined. She recalled feeling a distinct coldness enter her life, a chilling detachment that made it difficult to trust anyone, including herself, for years to come. She eventually suffered a series of nervous breakdowns, the grief of the lost child compounding the pain of losing Cooper, who ultimately returned to his wife. Decades later, even after rebuilding her life and having other children, Neal would speak of this loss with a fresh, raw pain, describing it as the great tragedy of her existence. It was a secret they kept for decades, a wound that never fully healed, proving that the glamorous romances of the silver screen often hid profound, private tragedies. The Factory and the Hysterectomy. In contrast to Neal's quiet grief, Tallulah Bankhead masked her pain with raucous laughter and a bad girl reputation. Bankhead was known for her wit, her chain-smoking, and her refusal to play by society's rules. She openly flouted conventions, but one secret she guarded fiercely was the physical price she paid for her romantic liberation. In her youth, Bankhead underwent countless emergency procedures to fix unintended pregnancies, treating them as occupational hazards of her wild lifestyle. However, the primitive medical techniques of the time eventually took their toll. She treated the procedures with a cavalier attitude in public, joking about her vices, but privately, her body was paying the price for the era's lack of safe reproductive health care. The repeated trauma to her uterus and the infections that often followed these back-alley surgeries created a medical crisis that could not be ignored. The cumulative effect of these surgeries ravaged her internal organs. By her early 30s, Bankhead was forced to undergo an emergency hysterectomy due to a disease that had been exacerbated by previous botched surgeries. When she woke up in the hospital bed, groggy from anesthesia, and was told she would never be able to bear children, the woman who famously claimed to have no regrets was devastated. For a woman who defined herself by her excess of life, more drinking, more talking, more loving, this finality was a quiet death. It stripped her of a choice she didn't know she wanted until it was gone. The bravado she wore like armor cracked, revealing a deep vulnerability. She realized that her rebellion against traditional values had ultimately robbed her of a traditional joy. She would watch other women with their children in the park, hiding behind large sunglasses, her usual sharp tongue silenced by a sudden, overwhelming envy. She spent the rest of her life playing the role of the eccentric aunt, the godmother, the woman who didn't need a family. But friends knew the truth. Her excessive drinking and manic behavior were often mechanisms to drown out the silence of a nursery that would never be filled. She doted on her pets and her friends' children with an intensity that betrayed her longing. She had sacrificed her fertility on the altar of her own legend, a trade-off that left her lonely in her final years. The tragedy of heroin. For women of color in Hollywood, the pressure was doubly crushing. Dorothy Dandridge, the first African-American woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, faced barriers that her white contemporaries could not imagine. When Dandridge gave birth to her daughter, Harlow, she quickly realized that something was wrong. Harlow was born with severe brain damage, likely due to oxygen deprivation during birth, a delivery that was delayed because Dandridge, a black woman, was made to wait for treatment. As Harlow grew, her condition became impossible to hide. The studios, which only cast Dandridge in roles that emphasized her exotic beauty, made it clear that a disabled child did not fit the image of the sepia goddess. The prejudice of the era meant that Dandridge was fighting a war on two fronts, one for her career in a segregated industry and one for her daughter's dignity. She was often denied entry to the very hotels where she performed, and now she was being told that her daughter was an inconvenience to the studio's marketing department. The pressure on Dandridge was immense. She was trying to integrate Hollywood while hiding a personal tragedy that required constant care and money. Doctors and agents alike advised Dandridge to institutionalize heroin, to put her away where the public would not be reminded of the tragedy. Crushed by the financial burden of heroin's care and the emotional weight of the decision, Dandridge eventually complied. She placed her beloved daughter in a state institution, a place of stark conditions that broke Dandridge's heart every time she visited. She would drive away from the facility in tears, knowing her daughter was alone in a cold, sterile environment, cared for by strangers who did not love her. This separation ate away at Dandridge's soul. She felt she had failed the one person who needed her most, trading her daughter's well-being for a career that ultimately betrayed her anyway. She was isolated by both her fame and her race, unable to find support in a community she had been forced to leave behind. The guilt was compounded by the knowledge that the institution was underfunded and overcrowded, a far cry from the care she wanted to provide. The guilt of abandoning her child to maintain her career contributed to the depression and dependency on substances that would eventually lead to her untimely passing. She was a pioneer who broke barriers, but the debris of those broken walls fell squarely on her and her innocent child. The aunt who was mother. Going back to the silent era, the blueprint for hiding children was drafted by legends like Gloria Swanson. In the Roaring Twenties, Swanson was the most famous woman in the world, a fashion icon whose personal life was as scrutinized as royalty. When she became pregnant at the height of her fame, unmarried, and in the middle of a divorce, the scandal would have been career-ending. Swanson, however, was a woman of immense resourcefulness. She did not choose to end the pregnancy. Instead, She engaged in a charade that would confuse biographers for years. The morality clause had not yet been written into contracts with the same legal iron as the 1,940 seconds, but the court of public opinion was just as vicious. A star of Swanson's magnitude could not be seen as loose or immoral without risking box office poison. Swanson traveled to France to give birth in secret, leaving the baby girl, named Michelle, with a foster family. She returned to Hollywood as if nothing had happened, throwing herself back into the glitz and glamour while her heart remained across the ocean. Months later, Swanson returned to America and formally adopted the child, claiming she was an orphan she had met in Europe. The press ate up the story of the benevolent star rescuing a war orphan, never suspecting the biological truth. For years, Michelle was raised as Swanson's adopted daughter, only learning the truth much later in life. Swanson played the role of the benevolent, glamorous mother who had saved a poor orphan, while secretly carrying the burden that she could not claim her own flesh and blood publicly. Even in private moments, there was a distance, a wall built by the lie they lived. Michelle grew up confused by the whispers and the resemblance she bore to her adoptive mother, a confusion that created a lifelong rift. Swanson's later years were marked by a struggle to reconcile this deception, but the damage to the mother-daughter bond was already done. The lie that saved her career had cost her the trust of her own child, who felt like a prop in a publicity stunt rather than a daughter. It was a performance that lasted a lifetime, a silent movie script played out in reality, where the intertitles read "Aunt" instead of "Mother." These stories are heavy, and we know they can be difficult to hear. We want to hear from you. Which of these Golden Age stars do you think endured the most tragic life? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and please let us know whose story you want us to investigate for our next video. The War for B.D. Bette Davis was known as a fighter, a woman who went to war with Jack Warner for better roles and better pay. Yet, even the indomitable Davis may have bowed to the pressure of the studio regarding her body. Early in her career, rumors persisted that Davis underwent abortions to secure her contract with Warner Brothers, choosing the long-term security of stardom over immediate motherhood. Biographers have noted that Davis, who was fiercely career-driven, viewed pregnancy in her 20s as a threat to the momentum she had fought so hard to build. She saw her contemporaries vanishing into domestic obscurity and refused to let that be her fate. She was competing in a man's world, and she felt she had to make the hard choices that men never had to face. To Davis, a pregnancy was a vulnerability that Jack Warner would exploit to bench her or cut her pay. She sacrificed her early fertility to cement her place as the queen of the lot. However, the psychological cost of these early choices manifested later in her ferocious, almost suffocating attachment to the children she finally did have, particularly her daughter B.D. Davis became the ultimate stage mother, projecting her own needs and anxieties onto her child, creating a toxic dynamic that would eventually lead to B.D. writing a scathing tell-all book. Davis tried to control her daughter's life with the same intensity she controlled a film set, perhaps trying to ensure B.D. didn't make the same sacrifices she had. She overwhelmed her children with a terrifying intensity of love, demanding total loyalty in return. She was terrified of being abandoned, terrified that her children would leave her just as her youth and beauty had. She kept diaries where she agonized over whether she was a monster or a martyr, a duality that tormented her until the end. When B.D. eventually rebelled and wrote, "My mother's keeper," it shattered Davis, who felt her sacrifices had been thrown back in her face. Davis's story suggests that the sacrifices made in the name of a career do not just disappear, they mutate, turning maternal love into something desperate and controlling, a shadow cast by the children who never were. The Mexican Spitfire's farewell. The most harrowing story of all belongs to Lupe Velez, the Mexican Spitfire. Velez was a comedic talent of immense energy, but she was typecast and often ridiculed by the industry she served. In 1944, Velez found herself pregnant by a man who refused to marry her, Harold Ramond. A devout Catholic, Velez could not bring herself to end the pregnancy, yet she could not face the shame of being an unwed mother in a xenophobic and judgmental Hollywood. She felt backed into a corner from which there was no escape. Her home, usually filled with the laughter of parties, became a fortress of despair. desire. She was terrified that the industry that had already pigeonholed her as a hot-tempered Latina would destroy her entirely if she became a single mother. She knew the tabloids would be merciless, using her heritage and her predicament to paint her as irresponsible and immoral. She paced the floors of her hacienda-style mansion, looking for a way out, but her faith and her fear were in direct conflict. In a final act of tragic theatricality, Velez staged her bedroom with flowers and candles, dressed in her favorite silk pajamas, and wrote a farewell note explaining her despair. She wanted to be found beautiful, to leave a final image that defied the messiness of her situation. She carefully arranged her hair and makeup, a final act of defiance against a world that only valued her surface. She placed religious icons around her bed, praying for forgiveness even as she prepared to commit what she believed was a mortal sin. She then took an overdose of sleeping pills. She chose to end her own life and the life of her unborn child, rather than face the disgrace the studio system and society would have heaped upon her. The tragedy was compounded by later sensationalized rumors about her passing, rumors that robbed her of even the dignity of her final choice. She died as she lived, the subject of gossip, but the reality was a lonely, terrified woman who felt the world had no place for her or her baby. It was a devastating indictment of the era's morality, a moment where the pressure to be perfect literally became lethal. The wish that never came true. Marilyn Monroe, the woman who wanted nothing more than to be loved, spent her entire adult life trying to create the family she never had. While the world saw an icon of desire, Monroe saw herself as a potential mother. She suffered from severe endometriosis, a condition that made pregnancy difficult and painful. During her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller, she conceived several times, only to lose the babies in heartbreaking miscarriages. One of these occurred while she was filming the comedy classic Some Like It Hot. The irony was cruel. She was playing a carefree ukulele player on screen, the epitome of bubbly joy. While off camera, she was in physical and emotional agony. She was constantly monitored by doctors on set, her every symptom scrutinized by studio executives who cared more about the budget than her heartbreak. While audiences laughed at her on screen, Monroe was bleeding and grieving in her trailer, terrified that she was losing yet another chance at motherhood. Rumors have long circulated that in her early modeling days, she was coerced into procedures that may have damaged her fertility, adding a layer of regret to her later struggles. Monroe kept a nursery in her home, filled with furniture for a baby that never arrived, a poignant symbol of the hollowness of her fame. She would reportedly sit in that empty room for hours, staring at the crib, imagining the life she was desperate to nurture. Her dependency on pills, often dismissed as the habit of a spoiled star, was in part a way to numb the physical pain of her condition and the psychic pain of her empty arms. She felt defective, unable to perform the one biological function that she valued above her career. She internalized her inability to carry a child as a personal failure, a confirmation of her deep-seated unworthiness. Her private journals from this time are filled with scrawled prayers and pleas for a child, a testament to a desperation the public never saw. She gave the world everything, but the one thing she wanted to keep for herself was denied to her by her own biology and the cruel timing of her life. MGM's most valuable property. Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed beauty who grew up on the MGM lot, learned the brutal rules of the game as a teenager. There are persistent, credible reports that during her youth, perhaps even before she turned 18, the studio arranged for her to terminate a pregnancy to protect her national velvet image. The studio viewed Taylor not as a young girl in trouble, but as a valuable property that could not be damaged by scandal. MGM controlled everything: who she dated, what she wore, and ultimately what happened to her body. This violation of her autonomy occurred before she was even old enough to vote. She was a child star transitioning into an adult roles, and the studio was terrified that a teenage pregnancy would ruin her transition to romantic lead. They treated the procedure as a necessary business expense, fixing a mistake before it could impact the stock price. This early loss may explain Taylor's frantic, lifelong quest for family and stability. She married 8 times and had 4 children, embracing motherhood with a ferocity that suggested she was making up for lost time. She surrounded herself with a chaotic, loving tribe, perhaps trying to fill the void left by that early, forced decision. Her chaotic personal life was arguably a reaction to the total control exerted over her youth. She rebelled against the studio fathers by taking control of her own romantic destiny, even when it led to scandal. She refused to be the good girl they wanted, living her life with a passion that was both destructive and liberating. She would later speak about her children as her greatest achievement, placing them far above her 2 Oscars, a statement that takes on a deeper meaning when viewed through the lens of her early coercion. She fought for her children with a protective instinct that she herself had never benefited from as a studio chattel. She became the matriarch she was forbidden to be as a girl, filling her home with children and animals, building a fortress of love to protect herself from the cold, transactional nature of the industry that had raised her. The mirror cracked. The tragedy of Jean Tierney is unique because the force that destroyed her family was not the studio, but the adoring public itself. In 1943, a pregnant Tierney volunteered at the Hollywood canteen, shaking hands with soldiers to boost morale. Imagine the scene: the smoke-filled Hollywood canteen, the sound of a swing band playing, and Jean Tierney smiling, shaking hand after hand, unaware that one handshake, a clammy, feverish grip from a starstruck fan, was passing a silent sentence onto her unborn child. She contracted German measles from a fan who had broken quarantine just to meet her. The result was catastrophic. Tierney's daughter, Daria, was born prematurely with severe deafness, partial blindness, and severe mental disability. The devastating diagnosis shattered Tierney's world. She watched her contemporaries raising healthy children while she navigated a maze of doctors and specialists, all offering little hope. The guilt was consuming. She wondered if she had been too vain, too eager to please the public, and if her desire to be a good patriot had cost her daughter her future. Tierney was crushed by the diagnosis and the financial strain of caring for a high-needs child. She eventually had to place Daria in an institution. Years later, the fan approached Tierney at a party, cheerfully admitting, "I had the German measles, but I just had to meet you." The revelation that her daughter's life had been destroyed by a thoughtless act of fandom broke Tierney's mind. She realized that her celebrity was not a gift, but a curse that had invited this tragedy into her life. She spiraled into a depression so severe it required institutionalization and shock therapy. She lost years of her life to mental illness, haunted by the image of that fan's smile. The shock treatments erased parts of her memory, but they could not erase the pain of that realization. She felt she had been punished for her fame, that the love of the audience was a toxic force that had poisoned her own blood. The fan had no idea of the destruction she had caused, treating the encounter as a fun anecdote, while Tierney stood there, her heart breaking all over again. She carried the guilt for the rest of her life, a victim of the parasitical relationship between the star and the audience. The woman who refused to hide. Finally, there is the story of the woman who refused to hide and paid the ultimate price. Ingrid Bergman was Hollywood's saint, the nun from The Bells of St. Mary's, but in 1949, she fell in love with Italian director Roberto Rossellini and became pregnant while still married to her first husband. Unlike her peers, Bergman did not go to a hospital for exhaustion. She did not hide the baby. She acknowledged the pregnancy and left her husband for Rossellini. She refused to play the hypocrite, choosing instead to live openly with the man she loved. She believed that her private life should be separate from her screen image, a naive assumption in an era where stars were owned by the public. The American public, who demanded their saints remain on pedestals, turned on her with a viciousness reserved for traitors. The backlash was biblical in its fury. Bergman was denounced on the floor of the United States Senate as a powerful influence for evil. Religious groups picketed her films. She was effectively exiled from Hollywood for years, forced to rebuild her career in Europe. She was stripped of her American stardom overnight, her films pulled from theaters, her name dragged through the mud in editorials across the country. Yet, she found a freedom in Europe that she never had in Hollywood, making art films that challenged her and raising her children away from the toxic spotlight. She proved that a woman could survive the system's rejection, but the years of exile were a heavy price to pay for honesty. She was separated from her first daughter, Pia, for years, a separation forced by the scandal and custody battles. The letters she received were vile, filled with hate from the very people who had claimed to love her, proving that their love was conditional on her obedience. Her story serves as the final proof of why so many other women chose the path of secrecy and termination. Bergman showed them what happened when you told the truth. The public turned into a mob, and the career you built was burned to the ground. She eventually returned and won her place back, but the lesson was clear. For the women of the Golden Age, there was no good choice, only silence, sacrifice, or destruction. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the hidden corridors of Hollywood history. It is often easy to envy the glamour of the Golden Age, but stories like these remind us of the profound human cost paid for that perfection. They left behind a legacy of celluloid dreams, but behind the velvet ropes and the Oscar statues, the real legacy was the nurseries that remained silent, and the children who were loved only in secret shadows. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, please honor these stars by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps us keep the Golden Age files open. And we want to hear from you. Which of these stories touched your heart the most? Was it the resilience of Loretta Young, or perhaps the tragic heartbreak of Judy Garland? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep the memories alive.